Alrighty, CXC attendees! Welcome back to those of you who were here before, and welcome to those of you who just got here. You are in for a very special panel with our guest, Sara Phoebe Miller, who is presenting about her experience from the editor's desk, pitching, writing, and drawing YA and kids graphic novels. Sara Phoebe Miller is the current editorial director at Boom Studios, following a healthy 13 years as the editor of the DC Books for Young Readers line of graphic novels. She wrote and published her first graphic novel, You Belong Here, with art from Morgan Beam in March of this year. You Belong Here explores themes of growth, change, and identity through the lens of high schoolers on Long Island. Give a warm CXC welcome to Sara Phoebe Miller.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm super excited to be here. And thank you for saying on Long Island and not in Long Island. That means a lot to me personally. So I'd love a show of hands. Who here is a writer and an aspiring writer? And by the way, being an aspiring writer counts as a writer. Incredible. Who here is an artist or an aspiring artist? By the way, being an aspiring artist counts as being an artist. Who here loves to read comics and graphic novels? Good. That was a test, and you all passed. So we're off to a good start. And no, we're not. It was working a second ago. That's all right. I can use the mouse. All good. So as the wonderful introduction said, I'm Sara Phoebe Miller. I was formerly at DC Comics as an editor in various roles for 13 years. And as of almost exactly 3 months ago, I'm the editorial director at Boom Studios, which I'm really excited about. But I'm very proud of the work I did at DC. And my book, You Belong Here, came out in March. So first, we're specifically talking about writing and drawing and pitching young adult and middle grade comics and graphic novels. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about does apply to other genres or demographics. However, when I'm talking about kids and YA comics and graphic novels, specifically, I love to start with a brief and very incomplete history. So, as most of you might know, as readers and lovers of the format, Superman came out in 1938. At that time, comics were very much for kids. They were bright, they were colorful, they were maybe even a little simplistic. They were cheap, and kids devoured them. Oops. Flash forward a couple of decades. In 1970, Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams begin to tackle more gritty, dark, real-life issues in Green Lantern and Green Arrow. Oh, incredible! Thank you! Yay! That's easier. Why I bring this up is because the theory is that the kids who were reading the early days of comics, Superman, Archie, all that good stuff, they grew up, became comics creators, and wanted to write things that were more for them, that were more adult, that were more mature. Of course, the genre, the format itself, the medium, evolved with the readers over time. And so around the 1970s is when there started to be a shift, and comics were no longer really for kids. They were really for adults. I love this cover too when I talk about this, because even right there on the cover, the word balloons talking about overdosing. There's a dead body right there. Green Lantern is yelling like hell. Very clear. The colors are darker. Really not for children anymore. Jump ahead another decade, we've got Frank Miller and Alan Moore pushing the boundaries even further of what superhero comics could be with their titles like Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns. Super dark, super dense, complex, gritty. Again, it becomes even more clear that comics aren't for kids anymore. Flash forward a little further, in 1997, a new generation is born, known as Gen Z. Gen Z come of reading age in the mid-aughts. In 2009, graphic novels have a new category on the New York Times bestseller list, so suddenly there's something sort of shifting in the industry. Also, we can't talk about Gen Z and comics for kids and YA without talking about social media. In 2011, Snapchat comes onto the scene. In 2012, Facebook buys Instagram. In 2020, TikTok surpasses 2 billion downloads. So there's this confluence of influences in the real world and in the new readers who are starting to age up, and a new genre emerges. Once again, comics become for kids and young adult with these graphic novels that became super popular around this time. In 2011, Smile by Raina Telgemeier comes out. Smile really transformed the industry in a big way. Dogman comes out in 2016, and in 2019, both Raina and Dogman top the New York Times bestseller list for all fiction. So suddenly, graphic novels for kids are outselling writers like Stephen King and Margaret Atwood, big adult sellers in the publishing space. This is huge for the industry, and all of a sudden, all the publishers are like, zoop, what is happening here? How do we all get in on this? It's super exciting. It's new. It's a new life for readers and for comics, really. And then young reader graphic novel imprints truly take over the publishing industry, which is very exciting. And I really like to say that I think these things are all related because Gen Z gets kind of a bad rap for having a short attention span, but what I think is that they just have so much content to choose from, and so much of it is so visual, so they can immediately recognize if something is for them or not, and if it's not, they can move on quickly to the next thing. Graphic novels is appealing in this way because similarly, they can flip through the art, they can look at the art style, they can see what their peers are reading very quickly in a way that's different from prose novels. They can immediately identify if it's for them or not, and dig in or move on. So, that's sort of a really quick, down and dirty overview of the industry in general, but we're going to start by talking about the pitch. If you're pitching to publishers for a YA or kids or YA comic or graphic novel, these are the things you probably need. So these are character designs from my graphic novel You Belong Here, illustrated by Morgan Beam. This was included in our pitch document for the project. Morgan and I pitched our book to First Second together. We went in as a team from the beginning, and this was part of the document. So in general, for most publishers, you'll want a pitch document, which includes a strong hook or log line, a short story synopsis, which can also be compared to what might be on the back cover copy, so really trying to draw the person reviewing the pitch in. Marketing hook, who is this for? How is it particularly marketable in any specific kind of way? Is there anything specific to you that makes it extra marketable? Add all these things in to the pitch right up front. Your bio, who you are, what makes you special, what makes you who you are, what makes you the perfect writer for this story. And then a full plot synopsis. You want to keep this as tight as you can. I like to say no more than 5 pages if possible, definitely less than 10 pages. But you want to give an overview of what the story is about, what happens throughout from beginning to end. And then typically, if you're a writer, a sample script. So for You Belong Here, my sample script had 70 pages, which was approximately Act 1. I sold a book, a middle grade graphic novel with my fiance who's here. Earlier this year, we had like 40 sample pages. Obviously, this is to give the editor or the publisher or the agent, whoever you're pitching to, a sample of what your writing actually looks like, what it sounds like, how your craft is, that sort of thing. And then I didn't include it here, but also if you have an artist connected to your project, or if you are an artist yourself, including some character designs and sample pages. So Morgan did, I think, 4 or 5 sample interior pages based on my script. If you have more, like if you have a full script, or even if you have a full graphic novel already written and drawn, you can definitely share that. But I think in ways the comics and graphic novel industry is different from traditional publishing is that because art is so intensive and takes so long, they don't necessarily expect to see a fully drawn book or even maybe a fully written script. Not that it's a bad thing if you do have it, actually it could be a benefit in a lot of cases, but it's just a different process, so it's typically, in my experience, not expected. And by the way, as an editor, this is what I look for as well, so I try to put in what I would want to see as an editor in the pitches I've done. What I also look for as an editor is a strong voice, so I want to be able to understand what the tone is, what the characters might feel like, if there is a sort of specific dialect in any way, I'm getting that from the pitch document itself. That really helps make a pitch stand out when I'm reviewing them. For kids and YA, often writers will include themes, and that can be really helpful as well, because that's so important to an effective story for kids and teens, having clear themes and knowing what they are up front and showing that to the person reviewing the pitch so they know what you're going for as well. Oh, there it is, character design and sample pages. And just a really clear vision, a confident vision. You know what the story is and you are expressing that to a person who is interested in spending money on it. Be clear, be confident, be concise. In general, the pitch doc alone, it's shorter really is better. I've never come across an editor who wants to see something that's over 10 pages. It just becomes hard to keep track of everything, and so the more concise you can be, the better. But again, when it comes to sort of things like a sample script or art, you don't necessarily have to have less is more, especially with art, but even if you're teaming up with an artist, they don't need much to sell what you're doing. It should be pretty apparent what the vision is from a couple of pages and 1 page of 3 character designs like this. I also have in my pitch for You Belong Here started with these sentences, and I'm personally very proud of that. I pitched this back in 2019 and I sold it in 2020, and I was digging up the pitch when I was prepping for this presentation and rereading it. Like having that distance and having the book already out, I felt like I did really capture what I was going for in those first couple of lines. So that's just an example of how to get your book, get your tone across, get your story across right up front, and so the person reviewing it knows exactly what they're in for. Any questions so far? Oh, awesome. I also use something called the Blake Snyder beat sheet when I'm working on something like a plot synopsis. So this comes from a book called Save the Cat, which is for screenwriting. It's a little divisive because it's a very formulaic approach to structure and story, plot, and those things, but I think it can be really helpful, especially when you're thinking of a graphic novel specifically, because typically in a graphic novel you have a set amount of pages to work with, so You Belong Here was approximately 250 pages. A screenplay is typically 90 minutes, or traditionally perhaps it was, and so the Blake Snyder beat sheet basically, I see this one, this example is for 110 pages. So it kind of gives you a format for where certain beats should fall within the page count, and that's super helpful in my experience to apply to your graphic novel when you're working on the structure, when you're working on the outline or the plot synopsis, to know, okay, if I have, let's say, 200 pages to work with, or I'm aiming for a book that's 200 pages, and the midpoint has to fall around 100 pages, and Act 1 will probably be about 40 to 50 pages, and so on and so forth. I just find it really useful to give me some foundation for where I'm going. I don't stick or expect people to stick as closely as they might in the screenwriting world, but again, I just find it a really helpful tool. And I often, when I'm editing, look at this structure to see how closely it fits with a script I'm working on. And if I'm trying to figure out something about the pacing or it's going along, I can use this to figure out where things need to move or be cut, and that sort of thing. So super helpful. I've heard that other graphic novelists use this as well. And again, it's simply a good tool, not necessarily something that's a requirement. I'll say as well, going back to this stuff, this also applies to comics rather than like a graphic novel. If you're pitching a limited series or an ongoing series, it's the same expectations. Yes?
Is the pitch document a PowerPoint or is it like PDF?
Great question. It can be either one. I see both, and they're both effective, and I think it's what you're most comfortable with or what helps you get the story across. I usually just do it in a Word document and send it as a PDF. Sometimes I even send it as a Word document because the editor may need to like copy and paste things onto their own sort of internal documents for the acquisition process. But I do see it in like a PowerPoint deck type PDF as well, and if that works for you, great. If not, a Word doc is totally fine too. I don't like to do anything particularly fancy, and I don't expect to see anything fancy. Also sort of different from film, TV, and animation, where I think people are used to doing a more polished sort of Bible type thing. I don't know anyone in the publishing editorial world who expects that. But again, if you're into that sort of thing, if you're comfortable with it, great. Okay, so onto the script. Here are some of the basics you should know. This definitely applies to any sort of comics or graphic novels writing, but I'll speak to how it's also particular to writing for kids and YA. I'm comparing a lot to film and TV, screenwriting, animation, because that really is the cousin industry to comics and graphic novels. We share the same language with them, same visual approach, so I find myself comparing to it a lot. But opposed to screenwriting, where there really is a set format you must follow, comics, for better or worse, doesn't have that. A script can really be personalized to whatever works best for you. However, there are some things you must have in it, and this version is what I do, what I've sort of developed for myself that works for me. As an editor, I see variations on this, but similar vibe. And what's most important is that it's easy to see the different pieces, page number, panel number, dialogue, sound effects, and there's space on the page itself, because when you're writing a comic book script, you're not writing prose, of course, and you must leave space for the artist to bring what they do to the project. So it's pretty clear if a writer isn't doing that, if their panel descriptions or dialogue go on for sentences and sentences and sentences. So keeping it kind of concise and sparse in this way. This example is very concise. Not all my pages look like this. Not all the pages I work with as an editor look like this, but I like to use it as an example to encourage that type of writing. So at the top, we have the page number. I do prefer when writers start their story pages at the top of a new Word doc page. So I do a page break between story pages like this, and I always have the story page number at the top because it's important to be considering the physicality of the book and the composition of each page and how that will translate to the artist and to the art. So page number at the top, panel number, panel description, dialogue. When it comes to dialogue, I like to number my dialogue, and I like when writers do this as well. Not every publisher requires this, but the publishers like DC, Marvel, Boom, who work with letterers that are separate from the artist or writer, typically what happens is you send them a lettering script where it is important for the dialogue to be numbered, because you're also sending them something called balloon placements, where the balloons correspond to, the numbered balloons correspond to the numbered dialogue, and this just makes it more foolproof for the letterer, because they may be working on multiple books at a time and they may not know who all the characters are, and they don't necessarily need to know, so it helps keep things clear for them. But I think it's really useful because, again, it keeps me on track with how much dialogue do I have on this page? Am I going over? Is it gonna fit or not? And it kind of gives it a nice clean format as well. So when it comes to what you write in the panel descriptions, I encourage emotional descriptions over physical descriptions. It's one thing to write that the character's mouth is wide open, and another thing to write the character is in utter shock and disbelief or something like that. The artist is really doing the acting of the characters, and so it's important for them to know what the character is feeling over what they look like or what they're physically doing and how they're moving in space. And then I just point out that sound effects are labeled SFX often in scripts. And so specifically when it comes to kids and YA graphic novels, again, sort of being as concise as possible is really important, because opposed to an adult graphic novel or an adult mainstream comic book where you can fit more on the page, the sizes are often bigger, and you can expect that maybe your reader is not reading a comic or graphic novel for the first time, so you can have more panels, you can play around with the art on the page more. Readability is key for kids and YA, so you have to ensure that what you're writing or what you're eventually drawing or what someone else is drawing for you is easy to read. You know the panel order is obvious, the order of the balloons is obvious, and you are intentionally guiding the reader through the page. The size of these books is also often smaller than what we do for adults, so you have less space on the page. The page real estate is more important, so you have to be even more intentional with what you're putting in your script that will eventually make its way onto the page. Also, it probably goes without saying, but especially with your youngest demographic, they may be reading on their own for the first time, so making it as clear as possible, as easy to read as possible without taking away from the story is super important. I like to talk about narration captions in particular. I think they are very common in especially young adult graphic novels, and that's because they are your first-person internal narration. So often in young adult, it's really important to get inside the reader's head or the protagonist's head to know what they're thinking, know what they're feeling. But sometimes I find when I'm working with writers or new writers that there's some confusion for what a narration caption is and how it's different from a thought balloon, or thought bubble. So of course thought bubbles are the cloud shape with the dots, and that's a quick moment of what a character is thinking or feeling. It's in the moment, it's right there on the page. These days in the industry, they're seen a little more cartoony, a little more childish. You will see them in graphic novels of all demographics. They're not as common in superhero comics as they used to be. There has sort of been a departure from them for the narration caption instead. But you will probably mostly see them in comics or graphic novels for kids, which is totally fine. But when we're working with a YA story or something for the teen demographic, I think narration captions that are first-person internal narration are really effective for that sort of reader. And that's because it also must be one through line from beginning to end. So the mistake I often see is that writers will have narration captions for different characters pop up here or there, or it will be more of that like immediate thought or feeling that like pops up. But that's not necessarily how it should be. Some of this stuff is knowing the rules to break the rules, so writers can do that, and they do that, and you've probably read comics or graphic novels where you've seen that happen, but it's important that it's done intentionally and that they know why they're doing it, and it's not because there's a misunderstanding of what this particular tool is or piece of the book is used for. So it's one continuous through line. It's typically the same voice, the same character, the protagonist. In You Belong Here, it's actually journal captions, so it's the protagonist's journal entries are the narration captions. And once you establish something like that, it's very important that you stick to it throughout the duration of the book. You don't have to have narration captions in your YA or any sort of comics or graphic novels, but I do think it's super common these days, and it is a really effective tool if it's used well. So I like to compare it to in musical theater. There's this saying: if you can't speak, you sing, and if you can't sing, you dance. I find it's actually similar to graphic novels or comics. If you can't see it, you say it, and if you can't say it, you put it in a caption. And the point of that is just each element on the page should tell the reader something different. So it starts with what you see, it starts with the art. If you can't get something across through the art, which you should try to get as much as you can across through the art first, you have the characters say something out loud. If it's something that they wouldn't say out loud to each other, then you could put it in a narration caption. But none of those elements should be repetitive with each other, and they each drive the story forward in their own way. Any questions so far? Yeah.
I think one question I have for scripts specifically, especially if you're working as like an author illustrator, do you find that including like descriptions, I guess like not just descriptions of what's happening in the panel, but like the composition of the panel, like this is a medium shot, this is an extreme close-up, this is a full page lead. Do you think that is helpful to include in the pitching stage, or is that something that you would say you get to more as you're kind of working on the actual book?
Great question. I don't think it's needed in the script. Could everyone hear the question? Okay. Sort of, this person was asking if you should, in panel descriptions, you should include sort of the composition, like if there's a close-up or a medium shot and that sort of thing. And I was starting to say, I don't think those are needed in the script. It's a great question because I actually like to discourage that behavior. If it's really needed, like, not that you can never do it, so if there's a panel that in your head as the writer, you're like, this is an extreme close-up, or again, like you're doing something intentional, you're like, I'm writing this so you pull in closer each panel until you get into an extreme close-up or zoom in on something important. If you're if you have something in your head like that, yes, go ahead and put it in. But you don't need to do that for every panel or for most panels. And like I said, in fact, I would discourage it because that's where you're leaving space for the artist. And this is if you're working with an artist, but also if you're a writer-artist who is writing a script that they're turning in first or turning in for the pitch document. It's really not needed because I think it takes away from the reading experience of like reading the script itself and getting to imagine it in your head as well, because the person reading it or the artist may think of it differently, and that doesn't make it better or worse, but especially when you're giving a script to an artist, you really want them to have the space to imagine it or reinterpret it in their own way as they see fit. You should be visualizing it in your own way as well while you're writing it, but you don't necessarily have to dictate in the panel descriptions what the camera movement needs to be, again, unless it's like really, really intentional. Great question, thank you. Yeah?
When you talk about consistency between either thought balloons or narration captions or what have you, are you saying that you probably shouldn't mix thought balloons and narration captions within the same book?
Kind of, yes. Again, if you're doing it for some specific purpose, go ahead. But typically, if you're gonna have narration captions, you want that to be the way you show the internal narration for your main character. If you're using thought balloons, you probably won't have narration captions kind of thing, because tonally they're sort of different as well. And I edited a book called Shadow of the Batgirl, which was a YA graphic novel, and the main character, Cassandra Cain, is nonverbal at the beginning of the book, so she had thought balloons, so the reader could see what she was thinking, and we had narration captions as well. That was really intentional for the character because of that characteristic, but that was sort of the exception to the rule, and there was good reason for it. Cool. I think I'm going to continue on, but save your questions for the end or afterwards.
Got it.
Cool, thank you. So, sequential storytelling, and again, more specifically for kids and teens, but this does apply across the page when you're working in this medium. Like I was saying, middle grade and YA graphic novels are usually smaller than an adult graphic novel. You don't need to memorize this, but for reference, middle grade graphic novels are often 5.5 by 8, YA graphic novels are 6 by 9. So you want to be really intentional, I'm using that word a lot, I think, with with your page real estate and aware that it's very expensive. So typically for both these size graphic novels, you'd want 5 to 6 panels max per page. When there's action takes up more space, so that decreases to 3 to 4 panels. You can go to 7 to 9 panels. I think more than 9 is really tough, but use that sparingly and with little action. You want to leave the artist room for one establishing shot per page, where the artist can pull back and reorient the reader for what's going on in the scene. You don't have to necessarily dictate that in the script itself, but just something to keep in mind that they'll likely need to do, or the editor might give that note. You want to change to a new scene or location on a new page, and use an exterior establishing shot when you do that. You can change to a new scene or location on the same page, but again, it has to be for a really intentional purpose. Typically that can be jarring, and there also isn't enough room for those establishing shots, so that's why I bring that up. By the way, this is a lot of information packed onto one slide that I could spend hours talking about more specifically, but I think it's good to just like put on everyone's radar so they can be thinking about this stuff. Your editor is definitely thinking about this. Artists are often also thinking about this, or they should be thinking about this. And all these things too go back to clarity of storytelling. The reader, especially for this demographic, needs to be obvious what panel follows what panel, what dialogue follows what dialogue. All the information they need on this for the scene is right there on the page. And there's not a lot of space on the page for all that stuff. So it's really fun. When it comes to dialogue, typically 1 to 2 balloons per panel, no more than 1 to 2 sentences per balloon. This writer, Brian Azzarello, actually told me once that when he's working on a Word doc and the dialogue goes over 2 lines on a Word doc, he knows it's going to be way too long for a balloon. The point of that is you don't want to cover up the artwork. And there's also this illusion of movement and a pacing where you kind of want the amount of time it takes to read something to reflect the amount of time it takes characters to do what you're depicting on the page, and that's because it's a static medium. But one good example of what doesn't work is when like a character is throwing a punch or something like that and has like a big word balloon. The timing doesn't line up and it can be a jarring reading experience. Typically, I like to say no more than 4 balloons max per panel, and in that case, one of the reasonings is that once you have a lot of balloons and if you have multiple characters, tails start crossing and it can be really confusing what balloon you read first or who it's supposed to go to. And then if you're not sure what to put in a panel, what the panel description should be, I have this action-reaction panel. So each panel is either a reaction, an action, or a reaction to that action. Again, that's because it's a static medium, so one character can't have both an action and a reaction in the same panel. It's just physically impossible. So I really like to think about action and reaction when I feel stuck. I think often that is sort of intuitive, but especially in the editing phase, when I'm editing my own work or when I'm editing someone else's work, I find myself thinking about that even more. So in this example from Smile by Raina Telgemeier, you see it in action as well. I have 2 reactions at the bottom, which could probably be a reaction and an action as well, but again, the main characters in the scene can't change expression in the same panel. Great to use for all sorts of demographics, but I think double page spreads are a really nice tool for kids and young adult readers because it's really an opportunity to open up the story, let the artist have their big moment visually. It's a moment that the reader can linger on, and it's always an exciting moment. So take advantage of things like this, double page spreads. Something you have to keep in mind is that it must fall on an even to odd number page. Like I have up here from this example of This One Summer by Mariko and Jillian Tamaki, one of my favorite graphic novels of all time, by the way.
Me too.
Yeah! This is one of the reasons why you write your actual page number on your script document, because if you're doing a double page spread, you need to keep this in mind, otherwise it won't print properly. This is an example of a double page spread with multiple panels. However, when you have a double page spread, it's not an excuse or an opportunity to pack in lots of panels. I've been guilty of this myself. It's so tempting to do that, but on a double page spread, especially for this demographic, it can get even more confusing what the read order is, because readers might not know if they read down, if they read across. If it's like a montage scene, if you're using a double page spread to move forward in time, and it doesn't matter what the panel order is, it's okay to do more. But typically you want to see something like this where there's one big panel to stretch across both pages, and then a couple, maybe 3 or 4 inset panels to like zoom in on what the characters are doing in that scene or showing some time passing. And then make sure you don't write or draw that something needs to be dead center in a double page spread, because if that's the case, it will get lost and distorted in the spine of the book. So compositionally, if there's some important imagery that needs to happen, it has to be slightly off center for it to work. So something to keep in mind, because I've been tempted to do that as well. And writers, artists really want to like get their big image right in the middle of the page, and it just doesn't work.
It hurts the eyes. Really.
Yes.
Sometimes I see, sometimes it doesn't, and I squint.
Yes, I do too. That's a great point. In addition to double page spreads, there are also splash pages, which is one big image on a single page. There can also be inset panels as well. But again, you really want this to be a moment the reader can linger on, they can sit with for a moment. In YA, it's often a big emotional beat or like an establishing shot of maybe the romantic interest or the frenemy or something like that. It signifies something important is happening and the reader should pause and pay attention to it. The difference between a double page spread and a splash page is really the pacing or the amount of time that takes place during that image. On a double page spread, it's often longer. On a splash page, it's often like a shorter moment, but still very impactful to include as you're writing, as you're drawing. Make sure you leave space for these moments because they're really effective and satisfying. Okay, the art. So these are a bunch of things to keep in mind. This actually came from a checklist that a DC editor put together decades ago, maybe at this point, that each editor needed to keep in mind for every single issue. There was more to it, but it was very specific to superhero comics, so I sort of pulled out what I thought was most relevant to YA and kids comics. Show, don't tell, hugely important for this medium, visual medium. Make sure you're showing the reader what's happening, what's important, what's special about these characters, and not telling it through words. We already talked a little bit about establishing shots. So important to ground the reader, to orient the reader, to help them feel like they know where they are in this world. Hero shots. So of course, this is typically, your big panel or splash page of Superman or Batman leaping off a building or something like that, but it's just as important in more contemporary stories or non-superhero stories. And what it means is really that you're establishing one of the main characters, someone important in the story, romantic interest, antagonist, with their full figure from head to toe, and the feet really are important to put in there as well. I see a lot of artists try to crop out the feet, but it makes a difference when you have feet in there. It just gives the reader that extra bit of information that tells the reader who they are. Dynamic figures, making sure characters are doing more than just standing and sitting. They're moving through space, they're acting, keeping it visually interesting. Camera movement, we were sort of talking about this a little bit when we were talking about scripts, but when it comes to art, the artist should make sure that they're moving the camera around in space, that it's not a page is made up of different camera angles and not just the same shot, panel to panel to panel. So you've got a wide shot, you've got a close-in shot, you've got a medium shot, maybe you've got a long shot, the camera's up, the camera's down. It's more dynamic if it moves throughout the page. Acting, we sort of talked about when it comes to dynamic figures. It tells the reader who these characters are, and avoiding awkward crops, so cropping off a hand in a panel border, like right at the wrist. Sometimes like you see like the elbow cropped out, and it can make the hand or the arm look like it's not connected to the rest of the body, so keeping that in mind. Making sure the environment feels real regardless of the story, of the style, So you can have simpler backgrounds, you can have more detailed backgrounds, but there's something about it that feels like it exists, it feels sort of organic, it's not just like copy and paste it on. And actually I feel like simpler backgrounds can sometimes do this better because say you have a brick wall and you're like drawing every brick by brick, it can look stiff or fake, opposed to if you're like have a couple of bricks and you're alluding to the fact that this wall is filled with bricks. Something about that visually I think can work better, feel more organic. I think simpler, you want to make sure you're drawing the reader's eye to specific things and not distracting them by the background, but keeping things organic and within your style that it feels realistic in its own way. And then, of course, the big thing with comics and graphic novels opposed to film, TV, I guess you could say animation as well, is that there's an unlimited budget, kind of. So opposed to having to pay to film at a specific location or pay for special effects or pay to build sets and things like that, it's all the artists creating the world. And that's just to say to take the character, put them someplace interesting, put them someplace. When you're watching film or TV, you may see the same locations pop up again and again, and that's because they're cheap. If you find yourself doing those kinds of things, pause and think about, can I put these characters someplace different that we don't usually get to see? Can we, doesn't work for a contemporary story like this, but like, are they in space? Are they underwater? Are they on top of a mountain? In a contemporary sort of setting, are they on a rooftop looking at a sunset? Are they, sitting by the waterfront? Things like that just keep the story visually interesting for the reader. Of course, artists are human beings, so they can't, they have their own limitations as well, and we want to keep that in mind and respect that, but otherwise, there's often more room to play, and it's good to think about the possibilities there. So, some important info on working with an editor. These are my top tips. When it comes, have an online presence, whether that's social media, a website. It sort of doesn't matter how many followers you have or anything like that, just that you have a place where people can find you, people can look up your work, look up what you've done, and that your contact info is very easy to find. I cannot tell you the amount of times I've wanted to hire an artist or a writer and I can't find how to reach them, and I end up DMing them or buying them a coffee on their coffee page so I can get to them. It can be very frustrating and it doesn't always yield the best results, so make sure your contact info is easily accessible on any of those places. If you're an artist, that you have an easy to share portfolio, and you have a combo of sequential pages, illustrations, black and white or color, and by easy to share I mean that it's on one single file or PDF that an editor can download from an email, save it to their desktop, save it in a folder, share it with other editors. And then be professional. If you are hired to do a comic or graphic novel, respect your deadlines. If something comes up, because life happens, be honest whether or not a deadline is realistic. It's better to communicate to your editor that you can't do something than to over-promise and under-deliver, or to disappear entirely, which actually happens more than I'd like to admit, and it's very frustrating and very concerning as well. So always communicate.
I've seen those in manga where the editor kicks the artist's butt.
I've never done that myself, that I can say,
to.
but
You wanted to.
no comment. Be friendly and understanding. Editors are people too, and they're juggling a lot, and they might not always be able to give you the attention you might need. Maybe they're dealing with their own personal things. Better to be nice and respectful than demanding and aggressive. We're all working together here. And then collaborate. Be collaborative. Take into account what an editor might be suggesting. Don't worry about disagreeing with them as much as if you get a note from them, thinking about what is behind this note and how can I address it without taking away from my specific vision. Editors' notes are often suggestions. That doesn't mean you can't take them, but there's something to it that you should consider. Something is missing from your story often, even if it's not the exact thing the editor wants you to change. If that makes sense. Collaborate if you're working on a team as a writer and artist. Collaborate with your partner, your creative partner as well. I think comics work best when they are collaborative. It's a historically very collaborative medium, and it's amazing to see the things that can come out of that. So that's everything. I know we have, thank you. Thank you so much. I think we have a couple of minutes left for other questions. Yes?
As an editor, how often do you work with agented versus unagented work?
It's a combo.
Okay.
In traditional publishing, it's very much more agented work, but I think in comics, there's still a combo of unagented and agented writers and artists. So I think comics is a smaller industry than traditional publishing, so it's easier to get straight to the editor and not need an agent. In superhero comics, it's really unlikely to have an agent, or not, it's really not very common to have an agent. I think that's also because it's a lot of IP work, fixed rates, sort of fixed contracts, so there's also not a whole lot the agent can add in that case, opposed to like original work where they can negotiate more on your behalf. Work for hire is a different ball game. So yeah, it's still split very much. Yeah. Yeah.
You said collaboration is good, but I think I was writing whenever I write something with characters, I go heavily in the character bio. Yet I have a problem with like describing the scene and making the dialogue. So it was good that you told me that collaboration can help with that, and as well as working with the editors. Too. Because
Definitely.
Because when I get into the character description bios, I get really into them.
Bogged down. Yeah, and that's great. Like, develop your characters, develop your story, but just leave room, especially if you're a writer, for the artists to bring what they might, because what's wonderful about that is that they might do something you could have never imagined. That's awesome and kind of the best feeling I've ever experienced. So, yeah, in the back.
So, building on this is kind of specific, but like you mentioned, like your pitch should have like a log line or a hook, but also a marketing hook. How are they different, or are they?
Yeah, they can sort of be similar. You're right. I think the log line or hook at the top can be like this is, earlier today I was talking about a book that's Nancy Drew meets Veronica Mars. Or it's like, this is a cozy fantasy kids book for animal lovers. You know, that's like your hook. And then the marketing hook is like, this is particular, like maybe, you know, as like I'm not, but I'm speaking as an imaginary person, like I'm a writer and I talk to kids all the time, and so like this could be marketed for schools because of my experience in X, Y, or Z, or like I'm a musician, there's a lot of music influence, like this book is influenced by music and I could write an original song to help promote this book. It's a little bit more like nitty-gritty specifics. It may not even have to be that specific, but that's just to give an example of what the differences might be. I'd say your like log line hook at the top is a sentence, and then your marketing hook can be more like a paragraph to go more in depth with it. Problem? Yes.
I was curious, given what an explosion of like middle grade and YA graphic novels there has been over the last few years, what areas of that space do you feel like are kind of saturated, and what areas have more room to grow?
Yeah. So in terms of what areas are more saturated or have room to grow, the middle grade market is very saturated. This is a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because it means kids are ravenous for graphic novels, and that can only benefit the industry in the long run. However, there's a specific few titles that are at the top that are hard to get past, or hard to sort of like break through. Those kind of take up all the attention. Dogman is ginormous, almost should be in like a category of its own.
Bone.
Huh?
Bone.
Bone is also ginormous. Columbus native, right?
Yeah.
Jeff Smith. Raina Telgemeier's work, also ginormous. This is fantastic. A rising tide floats all ships, but it is hard to break through that with something new. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, doesn't mean you should avoid it. Editors, publishers are still looking for middle grade graphic novels, kids graphic novels, but they don't necessarily want Dogman or Raina, they want the next big thing that hasn't happened yet. So looking at what's popular, not leaning away from that totally, but seeing for yourself where the holes are, what maybe you can bring. If you're pursuing that, that's different. I think YA graphic novels are very steady, and there is more room there, but and there's not as many like huge titles. What's difficult with YA and there are huge titles, but not the same way as Dog Manor or Raina Telgemeier. What's difficult with YA is that teen readers love manga more, it seems, which is also super cool. I don't hate that, but what are the manga readers getting in manga that they're not getting in YA graphic novels? And like, should they be the same? Should they overlap, or should they be different? That's sort of a question I'm tackling right now and trying to figure out, like, how do we get the manga readers over to YA graphic novels? It doesn't feel like they're going there, but they should be. To me, it seems like that. So.
I read manga a lot.
Cool.
So,
Yeah. I mean, manga's awesome.
Yeah,
Who doesn't
I mean,
love it? I
the
get it.
story, the action, the characters.
Yeah.
They feel like they're alive.
Yeah, and I think it's a matter of volume too. Like, there's so much manga on the shelves, and these series just go on for volumes after volume after volume. So there's something to be said about that, in the same way that there is for like Dogman. There's like 20 Dogman books out now.
And they come out weekly.
Yeah,
And
they
chapters
come out so quickly. So, but there's space for folks for sure. Yeah. Awesome. I'm so sorry. I think we're out of time, but thank you guys again.